Hi, Benji.
Hi, Michael. How's it going?
Good, good. Doing a lot of tedious work today, like going through the specs.
Yeah, I could tell.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that's the wrong camera. I really want to get a couple of things on the finishing lines. Okay. Especially like we wanted to aim for a yearly spec cut, but we are over it again. Like with the main spec, right?
Right. Yeah, of course.
There we should have been in October, I think. That's why we should get things like one-off into the spec, and then, I mean, there are already a lot of clarifications. We could just release it. There's anyway a question how we, like at the moment it's a very manual thing for the spec cut, and we originally wanted to do it yearly, and then it should be just okay, we cut it and release what we have. But I don't know what the process, like what is the process for us to cut a spec at the moment? Is there one?
I think Lee runs a script and the script goes through everything since it was last released and effectively pulls it all out into well, Lee's here now. Lee, what's the process for a spec cut these days? I was just saying, I think you have a script for it now. Or some of it.
The mechanical process, or the how we decide when the time is right to.
Yeah, there are two aspects.
First one's pretty easy. The first one's pretty easy. We just you know, I think we add a get tag and that's it. Because the actual specs end up getting auto-generated. So the draft one, I think we generate the most recent tag and then we generate the draft. Or maybe we do it when the tag actually gets created. I don't know. There's a script that does it. You're right about that. And then how do we actually come to the decision that the time is right to do a spec? I don't know. We've never really been very great at that.
Yeah,
but we probably should be.
Yeah, I remember that we said we wanted to do it yearly, but then we are over it again. Like
yeah. I think our cadence is looking something like once every 18 months or so, which I'm okay with. I think doing it somewhere close to annually makes sense. I think last time we went through a handful of things that we had at sort of the last stage that needed final review, and made sure that we kicked a bunch of them in before we did the spec cut to avoid a situation where we did a spec cut and then a bunch of stuff landed right after that. I don't think that we actually have too many things that look like that. Nothing that would probably hold us up.
I think the default values is one of the things that probably wants to get into that.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. That one's been floating for a long time.
Yeah, also one of I would like to get in. I mean, it's sitting nearly ready for a while.
True. I see Benji sweating over there as you say that. Been talking about one for a long time. Let's see, how many people are we expecting today? Expecting 10, and I think we've got 9. Good enough for get started.
Can we get the notes doc, please?
Oh, yes. I need to just add onto my calendar because that's my best way to set reminders for myself to do that. We'll see if we get the last person show up while I set this up. It'll only take a second.
Saying 3 people. So I think we're missing Jonathan, Ricky, and Yakov.
Oh, you're right.
And all three of them have topics. So we'll see how that goes. Maybe they'll join by then.
Certainly hope so. I posted a link in the chat to the notes doc, and I am adding it to the agenda doc imminently. For some reason, I got logged out of GitHub. How did that happen?
Could you clear your selection from it as well, Lee? Otherwise the pink is just going to keep following me.
Oh gosh. Yeah, sorry about that. There we go. I appreciate the desire for security, but I also don't really love getting logged out of things haphazardly. But here we go. All right, good to go. Let's kick things off. Hopefully the last handful of folks who have agenda items trickle in time. But I know we're a couple minutes over, so we'll get things going. Welcome, everybody. It's March. Can you believe it? 3
No.
months in, it's 2023. Yeah, I can't believe it. Where did all the time go? But we're all here, and that's a good thing to have. And of course, by being here, we've all agreed to spec membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide, and code of conduct. Fantastic documents that I've had in writing and have links at the top of our agenda if you ever want to read them. Let's do a quick round of intros, names to faces for the purposes of the recording, and then also just to make sure that everyone knows everybody. We will go in the order listed in the agenda file. If you're not there yet, go ahead and send a pull request. I will keep tabs on those as they show up and get them merged in. And I just merged the first of those in now, which was Vaughn's. Thank you. So go ahead, refresh that agenda file, and then we'll intro from the top. I'm at the top. Hello, everybody. My name is Lee. And Jonathan and Ricky and Yakov are all not here yet. So we're skipping over the very first three names in the list.
Hey there, it's Rob.
Hi, all. Hugh here.
Hey, I'm Benoit.
Hi, I'm Michael.
Hey, it's Derek here. I think Benji.
Sorry, folks. Hey, everyone. I'm Benji.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And then
Ivan,
I thought
I think you're up. Yeah.
I thought I merged your PR. Ivan, did I merge?
No, it's my fault. I actually submitted against February. Yeah, and I added myself twice, so I basically cloned myself, which is another point for like discussion we had a couple of times ago about having some mechanism to add yourself to agenda instead of doing PRs. So now I'm fully agreed that we need some simpler system.
I'm not stopping you from building that tool.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Careful what you ask for.
So if we have this discussion, hi, my name is Ivan and I'm from Apollo.
Welcome all, welcome friends. Benji, thank you for being our consistent champion of notes. Is anybody able to jump in and help note take along with Benji, especially in moments where Benji's chiming in with discussion?
Yeah, I can help for sure.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hugh. And then if the notes end up slowing down for anybody else, just chat for help. Quick look over our agenda for today. I'll do a quick recap of prior meetings for folks who weren't there. This might be short because I think some of those were short. I don't know that we have too many previous meeting action items, just purely because we haven't had too many action items recently, but we will take a quick look. I have a RFC up that has a little bit of feedback on it, but I thought it would be good to have a discussion about root operation types, clarity in the schema text. Jonathan, who I hope joins later, wants to talk about Graphical's upcoming big features and is going to ask for some help. Ricky wanted to float a topic about NPM access, which I think unfortunately may be blocked on me. But Benji, I think you have some context in case Ricky can't show. Default value validation status checks. I know we talked about that last time, so that should be exciting. Of course, always super interesting things to talk about on different stream. And then GraphQL over HTTP. Very cool to see that on the agenda. That should keep us busy. Anything that we don't have here that we want to talk about today?
Meta on the agenda. The agenda says put your name in there in alphabetical order, and literally no one does that. Should we either remove that from the agenda, or should we start actually putting our names in alphabetical order? The advantage of doing it in alphabetical order should be that the number of merge conflicts should be reduced slightly.
Yeah, we end up seeing them mostly anyway, but you were correct. That's the preferred reason of why it is in alphabetical order, is to hope that people, one, don't insert themselves twice, because you'd certainly find that if you miss the alpha sort. But yeah, it does reduce a little bit of the merge conflicts when we're merging these all in right before the meeting. I'm going to leave it there. I guess let this be a nudge that folks should think about alpha sorting the attendee list as they add themselves. But maybe another good vote in favor of having a tool that can automate this addition for us. If anybody's ever interested in writing that.
So I can open my PRs in alphabetical order, but the question I got is it by first name or last name or combination of those? Or what's the
Yeah,
what's
I
the
was
order?
thinking. I was thinking
Let's do
the
it by
same
first
thing.
name, because that way you can
Yeah.
just
First
sort it
name.
with your editor. If you do it last name, you have to like put effort in.
I think I will get to this maybe 50% of meetings where the night before I will pull this down in VS Code and select. I usually leave myself at the front because it just is like a smoother transition. And generally I would say it's not just that I'm putting my name at the front, but like whoever is the meeting DRI or whoever's leading the meeting should have their name at the front. And occasionally that has been Benji, occasionally that has been other folks. But to the degree that's me leading it, I'll put it at the top. Then everyone, I just like select them and I go into VS Code and I use the command to alpha sort. And then because of the way that we put the data in there, it sorts by first name, then last name.
Yeah, it's might be worth calling out
and-
too that we don't really say anything about alphabetical order when people just kind of try to merge into the agenda. You have to click into the join a meeting markdown file to see that notice about the alphabetical order. So maybe people just miss it there.
That's a good point. I'll look at the template. I think maybe I can put like a comment below the attendee list that mentions, please insert yourself in alphabetical order below the host. Do that. Because that's probably where you go to look at it as you go to insert your name.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Let's review prior meetings. The secondary APAC one, we canceled one of these. Oh, we canceled the secondary EU one. So that was 2 weeks ago. I think we had just enough people who were traveling or on vacation or whatever. The attendance for this got really thin. Benji and I were both going to not be in attendance. We just made a kind of a last minute call to cancel that meeting. And I think there were only 2 things on the agenda, one of which was mine, that we forward onto this meeting. So we'll do that every once in a while. I think having 3 meetings a month makes it a little bit more more reasonable to allow one of them to get canceled every once in a while. So not a ton to update from that one, but the one prior to that, the APAC secondary one, had both a good conversation about schema definition ambiguity from Benji that spotted a very real problem and introduced a very good looking solution that very quickly got to stage one. It was also part of the inspiration for me doing a bit of the rewrite that's my agenda topic today, so that nudge. And then pretty significant advancement of the fragment argument back from Matt, which I don't think we have on our plate to talk about today, which is totally okay. But folks should go back and look at that if you haven't had a chance. I think we've made a significant amount of progress. Thank you, Matt. And it's very exciting. I think it's going to be a huge change to GraphQL for the positive once we get that in great shape. So I think there's probably opportunity to continue to collect feedback on both the code PR and the spec details. Any questions about prior meetings? Cool. Let's take a quick look at open issues. Am I correct in saying, okay, yes, nothing open for review at the moment. We actually have a lot of really old actions. I'm not going to go through these live in the meeting, but unless anyone wants to veto, I may go through and just garbage collect anything that's like more than a year old, because we have like half of these are from 2021. And I think some of them are like asking for reviews for things that have gone into holding patterns. So let this be a call. If there's any actions, pull that up. If there's any actions there that you'd like to see not garbage collected, drop a note in them. Otherwise, after the meeting, I'm going to go garbage collect a bit. Okay, first agenda is mine. Root operation types. So let's see if it's worth me projecting for a moment. I put up both a spec RFC pull request, as well as pointing at Benji's change that fixed a handful of these things. So I think most of this is actually getting our or am I confusing myself? Did I add the wrong link on the code PR? Anyway, let me talk about the spec PR change first, which may necessitate some additional code changes. I'm going to project my screen. 1 sec while I do that. Can y'all see this? Cool. So proposal here is to do two things. One is a bunch of naming convention and clarity in the spec. And then there's one actual significant syntax change. This was the follow-on from the conversation that we had in the APEC follow-up conversation 3 weeks ago. Benji led this discussion, which was specifically around this idea of, is it okay to have a schema definition in the type description language that has nothing in it? And at present, that is not allowed. This proposes changing that to allow that to be the case. Part of the rationale for why I think this is the right change is we actually have a handful of other cases where you can define elements of the schema that would parse, but would certainly not validate, with the expectation of this was sort of the purpose of the extension syntax, that you should be able to define some element of your schema and then use extensions to add into it so that after having done the extensions, it's now in a state where it is valid. So this allows schema to sort of apply that same principle. And so really what this is a syntax change. And as a result, would allow us to define a schema that is temporarily not valid. And so this probably will require a code follow-up to make sure that there's the correct delta between parsing this and creating a partial schema and then creating the valid schema. Since there's kind of two things going on, it's probably helpful to first just collect a bit of feedback on, does this seem reasonable? Is this the right change? It's a bit of a trade-off. What do folks think about this?
Isn't that when I would pass the schema without this in it, like I pass the first schema and build with that an incomplete schema, I implicitly created the schema, and then I also could apply the extent on it. So it's not necessary that we have that, or?
It is necessary because of our logic for picking up default named types. So I will highlight just a few points from Benji's presentation a couple of weeks ago, which was, imagine you have a schema that's talking about viruses and mutations of viruses, and you have some type in your type schema called mutation. And it's not referring to like the GraphQL mutation root type, it is referring to a viral mutation in your actual focused schema. In the absence of a schema definition, GraphQL will look at that type called mutation, assume that it is the GraphQL mutation type, and then lift it into being the mutation root type. And the way that you avoid that is by explicitly defining your schema and saying that there is no mutation type, or your mutation type is, you know, GraphQL mutation or something that is named differently. But what do you do in the mode where you're using the extend schema to add things later? The answer is that you need to be able to define an empty schema.
Yeah, it's kind of making sure that we don't infer. I missed that aspect, yeah.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So defining this means this defines a schema that has no root types. So it's not the same as the absence of it. And therefore those root types are not going to be gone and searched for with default names. I see some hands, Matt.
Yeah, so for me, this makes sense, but also like the argument is symmetric with, we should allow, at least in the language, to have empty interfaces and object definitions.
I think we do we not already allow that in syntax?
When you extend, we allow it to you to not include the curly braces, but we do not allow that, at least as of the last time I checked. Maybe it has changed. I'm pretty sure we do not allow an empty, like no fields for interface or union when it's just type or interface without extend.
Oh yeah. I think I remember what you're talking about.
Yeah, because
we allow it to be empty, and you can extend it to add fields later, but the actual syntax of how we do that omits the empty block. So like the equivalent here would be just saying the word schema with nothing after it, as opposed to schema with an empty set of braces.
But we don't allow type with no braces. It's only extend type with no braces. And that's, to me, what we're basically saying is that we are allowing, like, we're allowing syntax that will result in an invalid schema in the absence of extensions. And
Correct.
I think that that's correct. I think that that's exactly what we want to do, but like we should symmetrically do that for types and interfaces, in my opinion, and possibly even unions.
That is good feedback, and I agree with that. Yeah, we should make sure that we apply a decision like this symmetrically. Yvonne, I see your hand.
Yeah, I actually wanted to say exactly the same. I can provide a little bit more context on that. Actually, last time I checked, GraphQL Java supported empty braces on type as spec extension, because for like community it's logic. And when we discuss empty types, basically your argument was that empty curly braces is like parser should catch like incorrectly empty types. So we did it like in weird thing, which like type and name and without anything, and this constitute empty type, and it's created like with parser ambiguity, where a type is followed by a query, and is it like invalid type, or is it like a type followed by a query, or empty type and a query. So we change our parser to be like forget how it's called, greedy, and try to parse more things. So I'm like for actually allowing empty curly braces, since we cannot do just schema without it. I understand why, because there is no like name, and schema will eat like next word. So it's like weird without curly braces. So I'm for like reversing decision and allowing curly braces on types, especially since like GraphQL Java, one of the main implementation, already supports it, and people actually like it more. Empty types are confusing for people. Like current syntax is like very confusing. Apollo have like Apollo RS GraphQL implementation in Rust, and I spoke with engineers working on it, and it's the most confusing thing. And another thing maybe related to that, first is confusing is the syntax, and second thing, it's confusing for people to understand difference between valid schema, full schema printed as SDL, and partial schema printed as SDL, which is not valid schema. So schema without query type is invalid, but you can specify it as SDL. This is very confusing thing to people, and I like spend a lot of time on multiple occasions explaining that there is like intermediate schemas and finalized schemas. So it would be useful to have this concept in a spec, saying like, this is valid SDL, but is not valid schema by itself. To have a distinction.
I agree with that. And in particular, I think there have been decisions we've made in the past that in hindsight, probably not ideal, around allowing the syntax to represent invalid schemas correctly for the purposes of printing errors or whatever, even just presenting it so that it can be edited and corrected back into help. We have other tools for highlighting invalidations that do not need to be syntax errors. I suspect that is going to be a relatively small, but still can of worms as we open it up to decide like which sets of things should and which sets of things should not have empty curly braces. How do folks feel about doing this incrementally, sort of starting with schema as our test case and then having a fast follow to look at the rest of the SDL? Or should we do this as a holistic change?
Are we talking? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm pro that, but I'm also pro like splitting changes into minimal things, even if they don't necessarily make sense without combining them all as a whole. So
Are we talking PRs or are we talking spec releases? If PRs, yeah, let's go for it.
PRs.
Yeah, I was thumbs up to PRs as well.
Okay, this has been super helpful. This is part one of 2 parts of the change here, but this was the one that made real syntactic changes, and I had a suspicion that I would get good feedback, and I did. So thank you for that.
Before we
The
move
rest of, please.
So I think we were talking previously about where people combine the schema together from multiple schema files that have all the different parts in them. So if you imagine that you're using none of the default root names, but you happen to have a type called query and a type called mutation, and they're each defined in their own file, like there's a file for query, there's a file for mutation, one for subscription that relates to Stripe payments or something. Would you then expect to put this schema with empty braces in each of those files to kind of indicate that that's not a root operation type? Or would it be like an extend schema, but with nothing inside of the braces that doesn't do anything? Or just that there would be a schema in a file on its own and all these other types will leave on their own and we don't care because we know that they're partial and we only worry about it once we've concatenated everything?
I think it depends on, like, right now we don't have any kind of specified description of how to treat multiple files, and so we've left that a little bit up to the implementer. And I think there's 2 separate ways that would seem completely reasonable to me. One would be boring concatenation, so like each file stands on its own to a degree, but they're only really evaluated by adding them all together. And in that mode, I would imagine like one file somewhere has the empty schema at the top, and then all the other files have the extend. And then the other mode is something where you do some like slightly more complicated merging, where you merge like duplicate schemas, you allow that and you merge them together, and there's some like tool specific rules for how that works.
I think
Matt, go ahead.
Simply allowing for extend schema with curly braces with nothing in it, even though it's extending with nothing, I think that might be nicer because then you can just concatenate them all still. Yeah,
as like we actually have finally sharded our schema like for our tooling, and that's exactly how I would do it. Is right, put the schema with empty curly braces at top, and then when you have a type that is the root type co-located with that type in the same file, I would do the extend schema. Like extend schema query my query type, then type my query type, like stacked right on top of each other. But yeah, this basically helps us make that file sharding more possible and reasonable, especially once you start getting into like schema modularity, where a schema is composed of potentially many schemas.
That was my question, because the extension API is useful if each of these schema parts also can stand kind of in their own, right? Otherwise, you can just concatenate them.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Good extra point. Anything else on the syntax to add before I move on to part 2? All right, on to part 2. Part 2 here is primarily just about naming conventions and clarity. In particular, there is 2 things that are going on that felt really hard to read to me that I'd like to resolve. One of them is we intermix these words kind and type, which I appreciate are synonymous, but we currently use the word type to refer both to GraphQL types, but then also to like categories of things. So we say an operation can be a query type or a mutation type or a subscription type. And we're not talking about like a GraphQL type. We're talking about the fact that there's 3 variants of an operation. And so we've overloaded that word a bit. And there's not too many places where that occurs. This is, I think, maybe the only one or one of few. But my pitch is to exclusively use the word type to refer to a GraphQL type to avoid that overloading, and use the word kind instead. While synonymous, it gives us a separate word to use to talk about non-GraphQL type things that have variety, where you want to be able to specify like which variant you're referring to in that moment. We're already a bit inconsistently using both of these 2 terms. And so my pitch is to actually go through anywhere where we're defining real elements and shift them to use the word kind. And then I have some other, the second category is sort of setting clear names to how we talk about things at the root, and then how we talk about these overall definitions as a result. But maybe first, to get quick feedback on this type versus kind naming convention. Folks have thoughts on this?
I'm just looking at, because at the moment, no, we on the operation definition node, we are using operation, and then it returns an operation kind. Is that correct?
Which thing are you referring to?
More GraphQL.js, because
in GraphQL.js.
these we use, right?
Yes, we use the terms type and kind to refer to this concept of what variety of operation are you referring to interchangeably right now. And my pitch is to not do them interchangeably and specifically use the word kind for that concept. The place that I'm looking at it within the spec is within the syntax. There's a syntax rule called operation type. And it's operation type is one of the keyword query, the keyword mutation, or the keyword subscription, and explicitly wanting to change that to operation kind. Because I find that very confusing, because we also talk about operation type as the root type for a query, the root type for mutation, the root type for subscription. And my goal here is to make it a lot more clear when we're referring to the variety of operation and when we're referring to these like root types, GraphQL types. But you're right, in GraphQL.js, we're probably also using those 2 terms interchangeably.
Yeah, I will say from a community GraphQL usage and education point of view, people have just for years are just used to the idea that there are 3 operation types and they know exactly what those types are. So I think just as long as we're not changing that, we're not messing with years of history, that's awesome. Don't want to have to re-educate people that way.
Yeah, it's just a minor variant in the synonym we're using there to call it what kind of operation is this,
Right.
rather than what type of operation is this. But otherwise, concepts under the hood are exactly the same.
Right.
This second naming convention change this is suggesting is how we talk about the things at the root. There's 2 things that we could refer to at the root. We could be referring to the type at the root. And right now, the words that we use in the spec is root operation type definition. And part of what I'm trying to do is simplify that a bit. We're using the word root in a redundant way, and to just make it very clear that this is the operation type. So you don't need to repeat the word that it is root, because that is definitionally known by the fact that it is the type of the operation. And you can imagine why shortening that name up and making sure that we're being very clear about an operation has a type definition. It gets confusing if you don't first rename the first thing to kind. Because operation type and operation type definition sound like they'd be referring to 2 subtle variants of the same idea, and they're very much not. One's talking about what which of those three kinds of operations you're using, which keyword are you using, and the other one's talking about an actual GraphQL type. The other thing that is talked about in the sense of a root is we will often talk about root fields. And this to me feels like a holdover from the earliest versions of GraphQL actually required that you had one root field that came from, there wasn't really a type at the top. There was just like a collection of root fields that GraphQL made available, and you chose one. And in the GraphQL we all know and love, that's not the case. There's a type and there's a selection set that applies against that type. And looking for a way to replace the concept of a root field as broadly as possible with the idea of a root selection set, which is what we actually have that aligns more tightly to the top level type.
So I like the history there. So thanks for sharing that with us. I don't think that root field is necessarily going to be confusing for the majority of people who don't know that history of GraphQL. I think it certainly makes sense to me. Root field is one of the fields in the root selection set. I am concerned, as I wrote on the PR, about the similarity of the words type and kind, because they effectively mean the same thing in the English language, which you've already covered, and actually you've convinced me a lot more in what you were saying just now, which is great. But I would still, I think, push to differentiate these a little bit more if we can. Having root type and operation kind are so much more distinct, but still, I think, clear that to me feels like a preferable thing when it comes to the naming here.
The goal is definitely to differentiate them. The goal is also to be as clear as possible about what they are. And I think this is part of the thing that is difficult. Like, part of what I'm trying to unpack is that there's a handful of concepts here that we somewhat sloppily use interchangeably, and I'm trying to tease them apart. One of them being that an operation is defined by the particular kind or variant that it is, and it is defined by the type that the execution for that operation begins with. And so it kind of makes sense that we talk about it as root, but it feels like we're saying we're using two separate concepts in an overlapping way. And there's also, there's no requirement that it is used at the root. It happens to be operations, of course, define the root. But you could always have, a field on any type that refers you back to the query and allows you to recur in some way. Nothing that stops you from doing that. And maybe the right thing is to kind of stay with the idea that these are separate, but the thing that I would want to avoid is making it less clear that these relate to the operation by, because I considered root type definition as an alternative, but that feels like it gets it further away from what it is, which is it is the type definition for this particular operation. But I hear you about maybe the root field selection set is less confusing than I think it is. I don't want to eat all of our time on the topic, so I'm seeing people noodling on the idea. If I could ask for a follow-up here, it would be to please take a look at this actual change. I tried to highlight the top levels, but I think a lot of the devil's in the details here in terms of the actual spec edit changes about whether it makes things more or less clear. And so please tear this apart and add a bunch of feedback within, I'd love to get this right. So that's my request. Otherwise, I will yield and let us move on to the next topic. Which is. Oh, no,
I don't
where'd
think
it go?
Jonathan's here, so should we move on to Ricky?
We do not have Jonathan here. You're right. Ricky, the floor is yours to talk about NPM access.
Yeah, just a quick note, if you're able to, the way the graphical pipeline is set up, if you recall in December, we discussed that we had to remove my access until things were fixed, and they were. And so if you can, my access is restored for all of the NPM packages except for the graphical organization. I think I just need to be re-added to a team there. It should just be username ACAO or yeah. But yeah, just sorry to pester about that. But that's really the only thing I need. If you have extra time, there's also instructions for adding a DNS record for the VS Code Marketplace organization because we have an official VS Code reference extension, so to speak. But a lot of users have been asking us to get it verified, the organization verified, because it'll then their companies can sign off on it and stuff. So yeah, that's all.
What do we need? So
yeah.
I appreciate that this is sitting on my plate, and I'm sorry for letting it sit. I will get the NPM thing fixed super quickly. What exactly is necessary for the marketplace verification piece?
You're just adding a TXT DNS record that allows us to verify the GraphQL.org domain is matched with the organization account I created on VS Code Marketplace. And there's a whole bunch of other issues we can talk about later, but the NPM thing is the most important. So if you have any time for anything, just at any point in the next few days or whatever, just that, and then we'll figure out the other stuff later.
Yeah, you'll probably want to have.
I will get your.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Hugh.
Oh, I was just going to say you'll probably want to have a nice catch-all feedback email address set up for the VS Code Marketplace as well, because you'll start getting a ton of feedback from there. I don't know if that's part of the other steps we were going to talk about later, but just a heads up.
Yes, yeah, there's a bunch of other things. Yeah, I have a whole plan for that and for better group access and having bot users publish on NPM instead of mine and other things. There's a whole plan I put together. We'll get.
That's awesome.
But yeah, we're getting set up for GraphQL 3 in Monaco. Got some exciting things coming down the pipeline there.
That's awesome.
Yay.
Yeah. You should have an invite now to the graphical bit again. While I was in there, I saw that Matt and Benji, you guys have pending invitations for some reason, in case you ever want access. Those are sitting there probably in your email box.
You can't accept them.
What?
Oh, it didn't let me accept it. Yeah.
All right. Well, I clicked the resend button and maybe.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll give
maybe
it another
NPM
go.
will work this time around. But that one should be good. So Ricky, you're in and running there. On the NPM thing, can you send an email to operations@graphql.org with all the details you need for the NPS change, which I believe includes Jory, our PM, and me, because I don't have access to the DNS records. That's like a Linux Foundation tool, but Jory does, and she can just like open an IT ticket, and that should just like happen.
Okay, so that sounds great.
Basically, like, write the block. Like if you can imagine filling out an IT ticket for someone who would like go in and put in the right thing, just like write that in an email to operations@graphql.org, and it'll happen.
Okay, thank you. That's awesome to know. That's great. Wonderful. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. On to the next. Where did my agenda file go this time? This is what I get for trying to open up NPM at the same time. It's running a meeting. Is Yakov here? I don't see Yakov here, so we can skip over his default value validation check until next meeting. Which should give us plenty of time.
Oh, he must have just dropped. He was just here, which is interesting.
I thought, yeah,
Yeah,
I thought
he
I had
was.
seen him before.
Yeah.
Well, shoot. Well, maybe he had to leave early and we should have known that. We would have rearranged a bit. That's okay. We can catch him next time. We'll move on then. Rob, defer and stream, deduplication. Let us know what's the latest.
Yeah. So we have been meeting every week, working on this. We start sharing. And so just to kind of give an overview of where we're at, what issues we've been running into. I think we're relatively in agreement that we have landed on merging all the defers that are under the same object together. That gives you the guarantee that for every defer, there is a corresponding path. That path uniquely identifies where the defer is. There shouldn't be more than one defer at the same path. Yeah. Then from there, we've been discussing what do we do with fields that are both inside and outside of the defer, or in a defer and also in a parent or adjacent defer. Been working through this. We've also have had these constraints for a while now, and we've been like discussing solutions within these constraints where for every like defer, there's one payload per path. We've decided we haven't been sending like splitting up data that's all in the same defer into multiple payloads and sending them. And the payload that you get has a path in it. That path corresponds to where the defer was, meaning that maybe we're not sending data that's further down the tree with a path that's deeper there because that's not where the defer was. And we were only sending the payload once all the data has been resolved. In the context of deduplication, that might mean that there was the same data in a previous payload, and now it's not sent in a later payload. So, I mean, just a couple of basic options there. Like if there's no deduplication, that means that you have a field inside a defer and outside of a field, and outside of a defer, you get back the result twice. One trade-off with that is like, we do decide deduplication is great. It's hard to introduce in the future because clients are going to come to expect that that data is in both places. Kind of a half myth. Then full deduplication, that is hard because of this example that we talked through a few times where you, it could be dependent on the order of fields of which payload comes first, and you'd have to know at runtime how to deduplicate fields. You couldn't just go and execute both of these. You couldn't remove fields from one defer without knowing that this other one is going to be sent first. And so it can be done, but that means you have to hold on to more of the data in the executor, and you're kind of removing them after the fact. Even just doing like a straight up, like you're looking at this query and deciding that these need to be resolved. That could be kind of easy if you have a step ahead of doing execution where you rewrite your query, but that's not something that's in the spec because the spec kind of goes incrementally, recursively, like down object by object. So these are things that make deduplication hard. I don't think that like either the full deduplication or partial deduplication could be done in the spec algorithm without having some kind of way of like looking ahead at fields that before they're executed. So Yvonne and Benji both had a few proposals that changed some of these constraints. And basically, what if instead of giving you back all of the fields at the same time for this defer, you traverse through the tree and you can find where the overlaps are and you could send those fields ahead of time. That means that the client would be getting payloads that maybe aren't necessarily actionable by them because they need that whole piece, but it would result in not sending the same data more than once. Then there's also this interesting option where you have a query like this, and kind of our model right now is that once you get to a defer, you're kind of branching execution and running these fields again, and maybe doing some deduplication by seeing what other fields are in the as you're going down. But what if you're executing your resolver for most recent comment, both inside of the defer and outside of the defer? What happens if you get different results? If you're also deduplicating, I think that's a fatal combination where your client is probably using this ID field to know that this object is the same object that was previously sent, and getting a different result for the two different calls of the resolver could give you data that now doesn't match up with what was already sent. Well, yeah, and like this example, like these all got removed, but bio was sent, and now the bio is for the author of the second comment and not the first one. So if we are doing deduplication, I think we definitely need to make sure that we're not calling like the same resolvers twice, both inside and outside of the defer. We have to guarantee that the same results are returned. But implementing that with the constraints without changing the constraints that we have is hard. It seems like you would have to either, do as Benji proposed, where as you're going down the tree, you start sending data that's in the defer before the rest of the fields are completed, or you have to have some kind of cache where you're holding on to the result so that the next time you get to it, you can reuse the cache value. You could do that in JavaScript with a weak map, but that's not a construct that is usually in other languages, I think, and that could be hard to do. So kind of want to get everyone's opinion. What if we went full no deduplication at all? Is this even okay? Like that you could get different results here. What happens when if you try to? A lot of clients are going to write that into a store, like a flat store by ID. But a client that does try to piece it back together could run into problems. Yeah, just kind of looking for the group's thoughts around these issues.
So on the caching thing, I think we already have a handful of other cases where if you queried the same field multiple times, it's reasonable to expect that you would get a different value every time. I think most GraphQL services don't work that way, but there's nothing about the spec that demands that it cannot. And either clients will take the most recent, the newest one, or you might have a mode where you're actually aliasing them each time. You can imagine having a field that's called random roll of a die, and every time you query the field, you get a different number between 1 and 20. And if you don't alias them, then maybe they get merged and you only get one answer. But if you alias them and you get 3 separate answers, and there's no caching there, this query as written implies that you are hitting this most recent comment Well, I guess this is the central question, right? By wrapping it in a defer block, does that mean that there's a firm boundary here with that will not be merged as part of the collect fields algorithm? Because if collect fields algorithm looks at the defer and says, I'm not even going to look at what's in here, I'm going to set this aside and defer the entire thing opaquely, then that implies that you are going to have two separate fetches to that most recent comment field, which very well could give you a separate answer, in which case the payload needs to match the actual execution behavior. Or we say that it is not opaque. Field collection can occur. And by doing that, you're saying that this query and a rewrite of this query where the defer is wrapped purely around the bio field are actually identical. Like you're not going to fetch the top level field a second time because of the way that the collect fields algorithm has worked. You're actually only fetching that most recent comment field once, and you are somewhat intelligently deciding what are actually the field resolver calls that are getting deferred, and it is only the call to the bio field that is getting deferred. And so it's not actually possible in that case, even if calling the field itself could give you multiple answers each time, collect fields algorithm would demand that you've actually only called that resolver once. Like the middle scenario, just like we should not allow it to be true.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of where we're at here and like what the decision that we need to make is. I think it would be, I don't know if it's objectively better, but like assuming that we do like have the case where it does mean that the bio is the only one that is refetched, that if that's what this means, then I think that there are other trade-offs that we need to make, which is either changing the result structure or if we have to be okay with that kind of caching, or I don't know if there's a really clever way to know exactly that gives you all the, I don't know if there's a really clever way of that gives you what you want without having other trade-offs. Yeah, some hands up. Ivan.
Oh. Yeah, I want to provide context, and one thing I want to suggest, instead of like because we in this discussion for a long time and we discussed a bunch of solutions, maybe instead we formulate this question as, is it requirement? I think it is a requirement that the same path should provide the same value. And if we recognize it as a requirement, we can evaluate like solution, because like certainly not on this call, it's hard problem we try to figure out for like at least like a couple of months. So my question here, like first I provide a little bit context. Previously, we discussed this issue, and Liz, you said like we have other examples where values are different. I would say they're completely different cases. For example, aliases. Aliases influence like a path. Yes, you can alias like a field with alias, but it will result in another path. For example, you can have a random number, and you alias is random number 1 and random number 2, and it's logical you have two different values. It's logical that value is changed between queries. So if you send one query and get one field, and send another query and get like different value, it's okay. Here, what's new here and what we discuss is if you merge incremental everything into one query, not a normalized store, not in a store between queries, but you merge like the whole initial response and incremental paths into one query. Is it okay to have like same path resulting in number of different values or not? Because it's one question, how many copies we have? Is it one or multiply? It's another thing. It's another question. Is it okay to have like same path having multiply different values? I would say no. It's not okay, but I'm interested in hearing other people, what other people think. Is it like an issue or not?
The problematics thing, I think, is like we closed down the path of rewriting the query. And with rewriting the query, we could solve this problem, I think, quite easily. And I mean, that is essentially the same process as we do with defragmentation, right? We rewrite it in a different way, and then we could traverse and execute it. But that's a path we, for now, didn't take because we didn't want to change the execution algorithm too much.
Michael, I have thought about this a fair amount since we discussed this last, and I actually don't think we can solve this with query rewriting. The query that's on the screen at the moment, if we were to, for example, take this and wrap just the bio with the defer, that would be okay. But if we had something at the root of the defer as well to indicate, like with Matt's dunder type name hack, to indicate that a fragment is complete, we would need those two things to be delivered together. And as such, we would need the entire tree to be present. So I don't think we can actually do it just with query rewriting, which is why I started experimenting with going down the route of the field merging algorithm and pushing stuff, additional information through field merging.
Yeah, problematic would also be lists, right? With query rewriting, if that authors would be a list and you actually shifted defer to that list.
Yeah, and this example is one defer and the data outside the defer. It could be the same data in two separate defers at different paths with competing different fields that run into the problem of not knowing which one is going to resolve first.
Yeah, it might also be like a combination of the things that we all tried so far. But the problem, it's quite, all of these explorations are quite big, have quite a big impact.
I see there being like, there's two ways of interpreting if we think only in terms of defer, well, no, fine, incremental delivery. There's two ways of interpreting it. One is taking the data that you would have if you ran the entire thing and delivering it to the client in patches. So i.e. there would have been a final concrete payload and we're just sending that through in patches earlier than it would have come through, or with parts of it earlier than before. In that situation, it's absolutely the case that we would expect that every path in it would be a consistent value and it would never get two different values at the same path, as Ivan was saying. And I broadly agree with that. The other way of thinking about it is, especially with Stream, it might allow us to send through more data to the client than we might actually want to represent in memory at one time. So you could imagine if you do pagination through like a list of, all of the, I don't know, products in your inventory, when you're paginating over that in a web page, like you don't want to render too much stuff. But if you want to do like a query against that and then write it to, I don't know, a CSV file or upload it to a Google spreadsheet or whatever, in that case, streaming the subparts seems reasonable. You don't necessarily, it gives you the ability to not have to do pagination, just take the data as it comes and keep writing it very efficiently into this other source. And those are two quite different use cases. And I think we can actually support both of them, but we have to be very careful. So I just want to put them both in people's minds when they're thinking about this.
Yeah, and Lise, as you said, framing it as a constraint, I think that makes sense, because we could say that, yes, it's a requirement, but doing that means that we have to make trade-offs with other constraints. Right.
There's also, I think you're right. Yeah. That was my point there is I want to be really careful about describing anything here as a firm requirement. There's, of course, some things that are, but ultimately a lot of these things, like we're talking about a change. So inevitably there's things that are going to change about the way GraphQL works. And we just need to make good trade-offs between them. For what it's worth, there's a bit of a saving grace in the simpler option of if you were to treat this defer as an entire block, that you just don't even look at the, like we just say, all right, we're not going to think too much about deduplication. Anything in the defer blocks go through there, do a separate pass of collect fields. So you got your non-deferred and then your deferred sets of collections, which I think is your sort of the original pitch before we went into this thread. The saving grace to that one is if you are using a local caching mechanism in your executor, which I know many services do, then it is up to you to decide based on that mechanism whether you would like field resolvers to be to present different values or not. Because the other case where this can bite us today is if you have two separate paths to the same field. You can imagine, this is about blog posts with comments. So you've got one thing here that's most recent comment, and you can imagine having a parallel field, which is comments, all comments. And if you were to first query the most recent comment, and then via a race condition, you got a new comment and the list of comments has something different in it, you'd look at that and be like, what the heck just happened here? And you would imagine that the person under the hood has done some amount of caching locally, so you got consistent things that make sense. Or even something more similar, which is like, all right, let's just assume that the race condition part was solved and you got that done right. So you've got the list of all comments and you've got the list of your most recent comment, or you've got your most recent comment here. But then the content field, you got a different kind of race condition where someone managed to hit the edit and save button on their comment right in the middle of you executing your query. And the content of the body of this comment comes back differently, even though the ID is the same. And this race condition kind of problem exists today in absence of a defer field, and it is broadly solved by having sort of local caching against database fetching. So you just like only fetch against your database to the degree that you need to fetch additional blocks of data keyed by an ID. Which implies that in the simplest possible case of executing the particular query that you've got listed up here, you re-execute the resolver for most recent comment, which has a cache hit and is like, I already have that. And then you hit author, which hits a cache hit because you've already got that. And then you execute ID and name, which are just like simple field lookups. And then you hit bio, which is like, I need to fetch bio. And it's either also a simple field lookup or like that's the field that ended up being expensive and then you've like deferred the expensive cost of it. In which scenario it's the server implementer essentially has some control here about whether they get new information. It is certainly still possible that it yields a different result, in which case we need to make sure that it is clear that that could be the case. And so as you're merging in the incremental delivery of a payload, you need to make sure that stuff that comes in at a field overwrites the prior field as opposed to like purely merge. Otherwise you could end up with like a bizarre merge scenario. In which case this would, I don't know, the name field of the author could be different. Or if you refetched content, the content could have been different. And if that's going to deliver, you need to make sure that the new delivered value overwrites the previously delivered value. Is that how you've been thinking about this, Rob?
I think the problem there though, Lee, is like dealing with that from the server side is one thing, but it's the client receiving it that's the issue. In all the situations in current GraphQL, even where you've got, for example, the comment field, it's at two different paths where it's got different values. Like, sure, it represents the same comment by ID, but it's at two different paths. The issue here is If you've got something like Relay that deeply understands your GraphQL query, it's not necessarily a big problem because they treat the fragments as their own like little containers, and that can be self-consistent here and that can be self-consistent there. But for a more simple or straightforward GraphQL client that might want to see incremental delivery as effectively a patch onto an object, we can't just overwrite the field as you describe, because the selection sets are completely different. Like, at some point, that path needs to have the data from both of the branching trees if you're looking at it as a final object that you can navigate through. And those could be inconsistent. One of them might have 3 entries and another one 4, and one's got the bio field and one doesn't, and suddenly it's all inconsistent. And how do you even patch it? So we'd have, to allow for that, we'd have to not have the patching mechanism, and we'd have to almost force the Relay way of saying that we actually have to treat fragments as individual things, which we are not very strict on at the moment for GraphQL.
Not necessarily fragments, but deferred paths, right?
Their hands up. Yakov is waiting for a long time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just gonna. I posted in the chat already, and I think everyone's pretty much aware of it. But I mean, for a client that's using a normalized caching solution, even at different paths, you know, if there are different shapes of selection sets for the same object that's requested at different paths, a client that's attempting to you know, use a normalized cache, let's say by an ID, could end up merging that same object with the same ID, but and possibly an overriding, you know, as Lee suggested, with the new and you can get a mixture of results, you know, that, you know, so it's a tricky problem. And certainly incremental delivery makes things worse, because as you stretch things, because, you know, this will happen more often. The client will be requesting potentially, but it's not necessarily a new problem. What gets really tricky though is when, as we mentioned, when using deduplication, that this gets very tricky, because you can try to get out of some of these problems by requesting the ID, but even then, you know, when that's deduplicated, you really, you know, you get into worse. But the problem still, you know, still exists, you know, without defer. But I would, but one thing to also mention is that you can't necessarily assume, when we have incremental delivery, that the object that is delivered last is the latest. It could just be that, you know, some of the subfields failed to complete. So like a defer that, you know, arrives later, even though it claims it's the most recent comment, doesn't necessarily have the most recent comment. You know, I don't believe, because it could just be that some of the subfields delayed it. I have to check if that's still true now that we are merging some of the defers, but I think that's just something you know, to keep in mind.
Yeah, so one of the things I think that we're hitting, this like defer stream is really hitting its head against over and over. Just taking a like broad view is we have GraphQL JS. We're doing our experiments on top of GraphQL JS. We're able to prototype server behavior and server idioms really well, and we're able to answer, oh yes, this is possible. Oh yes, doing this deduplication of fragments of defers is possible up to this point. It becomes really hard at that point. But we don't have the equivalent like spec or canonical client implementation. Like right now, the client implementation, the reference client implementation is just the JSON responses, right? And nobody is expecting product teams to be interacting directly with the incremental payload, at least as far as I understand. Like, if we are expecting like, oh, you write a product, you have this at defer, and here's like, we want to showcase actually like writing a product using the actual deferred payloads. Like, do we have any examples of that? Do we have any like real usage, or is it always currently wrapped around like the Apollo or Relay or some what we're calling more sophisticated client? Because I think that that's really like, we have all these discussions. Well, if you're using Relay, it can work like this. If you're just using a dumb client that doesn't exist, because I don't know that there is one, besides like TypeScript, GraphQL, CodeGen. Like I don't understand, like I don't have a clear view of how we would map the incremental responses of any of these proposals into a quote unquote dumb client.
Maybe one thing we could do is release experimentally like a GraphQL v17, but with a couple or even different behaviors, like based on arguments, and let, you know, right now we're, you know, v17 is like an alpha, but if we released a version with experimental directives, even possibly with different behaviors, and let clients experiment.
Yeah, I'd almost argue.
I support that experimentation.
Yeah. I'd almost also argue for having a spec client in GraphQL-JS.
Really, because I think client is where the most variety is. Like server implementations, if you look at them, they maybe are schema first, code first, or annotation based, but in essence, they all work the same way. But when you look at the client world, it's completely where different clients work completely different. I argue there cannot be a spec client.
I'm just laughing at Ricky's comment because I think graphical actually kind of is closest to that, because the goal is to, it kind of is like it's the dumbest possible client in that you send it queries and it shows you the responses, but like in doing so, it needs to be able to support the entire breadth of everything that GraphQL can do.
We become an ad hoc.
So it's like not a perfect thing.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think there's a slight difference though with graphical, and you know it's the same for Studio and all these other types of tools that have an Explorer-like interface. Somebody that's using that tool is expecting to see a query, for example, that they're firing that has a deferred fragment in it. They're going to expect to see the data come back that they've asked for, and then they're going to expect to see the other data come back later in the shape that they've identified in their query. They're not going to expect to see all of the internal payload come across. You know, if they're not expecting to see all the incremental stuff and all the other internal stuff that's in there, I think that's kind of hidden when you're using a tool like that. And I think that's kind of what Matt was pointing at, that stuff, we don't really see that going to some kind of a more raw client.
That's a good point, and maybe we're getting in a bit of attention. I just got a quick point to make. For those tools, I certainly hope that they evolve to show like, here's the raw payloads that show you what's coming in raw. Here's the like replay the timeline and like have a scrubber, like have a way to engage with the fact that it's incremental. Hopefully that is good. But my quick thought on the dumb client, obviously, I don't think any dumb client in GraphQL exists really. And if they do, they're probably not using incremental delivery. But we should make sure that the floor of sophistication for such a client to take advantage of this should be quite low. And I think that's part of the reason why I've been excited to see the incremental payload structures here be fairly straightforward. It's like at this path, merge this data, and then just like loop through all the incremental payloads and do that. Like, you should be able to write a 100 lines of code or less GraphQL client that supports incremental payloads.
Yeah, one thing I want to say about graphical, actually, it's made me realize interesting thing. Graphical doesn't care about fragments or fragment modularity. So in that sense, it doesn't provide any like client experience. What is interesting, like imagine you're taking a query from like Relay or something, and just want to test it on graphical. And as a response, you get like response with a bunch of stream and defers. And it's hard to read. And you just want to like see for the bug experience, you want to see like overall thing. So it's not a long stretch. Imagine like is a tab of flag in GraphQL saying, please merge it for me into one response for me to inspect it. For me, it's like a real feature for GraphQL to have instead of like having, especially in case of stream, having like bunch of payloads, each have like couple of elements and defer on this stream and everything got out of order. You just press a button and everything merge into one final shape. And that for me answer a question about having different values for the same path. This feature becomes impossible if different paths have different values. You cannot represent, like in whole discussion, we discuss normalized stores with IDs. GraphQL doesn't have normalized store. The GraphQL doesn't have like concept of IDs, but it's easy feature to just match all the incremental with initial response into one single like object, single data, and this become impossible if you have like different values under the same path. So I think this mental experiment with GraphQL useful in that sense, at least.
Benji has a really good comment that, yeah, I know I totally agree with, for sure. Don't know what others think.
Yeah, it's effectively the same as what Ivan just said. Like there has to be this final state. At the end of a stream and defer, it should be equivalent to you having not done a stream or defer at all. And you just end up with a final browsable payload. And at the moment, some of the solutions that we're discussing give Quaku's issue, which is effectively they aren't mergeable. We can't reconcile them.
Yeah, that seems fair. And especially like the idea framing this as incremental delivery over like long-term streaming is correct in that even before introducing these things, fields get executed in an order. That order is somewhat well-defined by the spec, but still there is a sense of time passing as you go from executing the very first query and delivering a payload to the last. It's just that the final result kind of comes to you in one big lump at the end. And the goal here should be to make sure that that data is coming back to you in multiple lumps. So like, it's not like we're introducing a new concept by the idea that things get executed over time. That was the point that I was trying to make earlier about how you can already find yourself in, yes, via two separate paths as opposed to the same path, but you can already find yourself in a situation where you get two separate pieces of information that a normalizing client would have to figure out how to reconcile. And so like, I want to make sure that we're not overcomplicating. I think also a particular failure mode for incremental delivery is the execution algorithms are so sophisticated and complicated in the spirit of avoiding these corner cases that no one can really fully understand it. And as a result, no one trusts it and then doesn't want to use it. And I think we should also be pretty cautious to avoid that outcome. And if that nudges us in a direction where there's some surface level, obvious inefficiencies that are resolvable, like as long as they're resolvable, like as a server implementer and as a client query writer, you can have control over making sure that your execution is in the shape that you want it with the behavior that you want. Then we're okay. And if that biases towards a simpler outcome, then we're going to be in a better shape.
Yeah, I think that's
I
kind
fear
of like
that nudges us. Yeah, I fear that nudges us in the direction of allowing duplication, which is maybe not what we push for here, but
it is. I think that's nudging us towards option 2 at the top of your screen there, Rob, if you want to scroll up. Yeah, it's definitely been it's been listed for a while, but yeah. I know we're almost out of time. There was some talk about what should be a requirement versus a constraint here. And maybe if we just had 2 more minutes to nail down if we all agree on the constraints or the requirements, at least that will help set the tone for the next defer stream working group meeting. Should we just run through those constraints and see if we all agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, so well, there's the one that we're saying now, which is that the newest one, which isn't listed here, is that you have a final shape that that means that you cannot call the same field executor more than once, right? You have to either cache that result or do your algorithm in a way that it only gets called once, right? Then the other constraints are the one payload per path, the each path corresponding to where the defer is, and the client getting all of the data, all the data that is specified. Sorry, so where do we want to go from here?
People still feel those 3 constraints are valid?
They seem right to me, and I particularly like the distinction between requirements and constraints, that at some point we need to resolve this thread on something that there's going to be no right answer. I think that's the one thing that is plainly true, is that anything that we choose here will be a principled balancing of which constraints we keep and break with the goals that we have. And my only nudge here is a nudge in the direction of trying to keep things on the simpler side of the spectrum. Push back against me if I am wrong in that nudge. But otherwise, I think the constraints and requirements as you frame me here all resonate with me.
Right, but I think the problem is that we can't have these 3 constraints plus this new one without either having like adding that caching for a field resolving into the execution itself, which I feel like that's a trade-off where you're adding, it could be a significant memory issue for the server.
Yes, especially with stream and stuff.
Yeah, or the proposal that Benji had, which is to drop these 2 constraints to give us the one where we're going down the tree and executing in a way that things don't get resolved more than once.
I would reformulate constraint number 2 into not that path is tied, but as we have some mechanism for clients to understand when certain fragment is satisfied. The simplest mechanism is to have matching path, but it's the simplest mechanism. It's not the only one. So if we use like labels, or Benji proposed like pending thing that we need to do anyway. So I would say goal here is not necessary that path is much, is that client can have a mechanism to understand that a fragment at certain path is fulfilled at some point.
I'm going to wrap it since we're over time. But I think Benji's comment is like a great kind of summary, and is probably worth copying and pasting into the thread. Of the first 3 constraints all feel like nice to haves, and all feel relatively breakable without a ton of pain, and the requirements all feel essential. So we got to focus on the requirements over the constraints as written today. Thank you, Rob, for talking through this. This is not easy, but I trust that you've got us pointed in the right direction. Thank you for being extremely detailed and thoughtful as we navigate through this.
Yes, that's great.
All right, folks. That wraps us for today. I know we didn't get to everything on the list, but we do have the follow-on meetings later in the month. So hopefully see most of you there.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Take
Goodbye,
care.
Bye,
guys.
friends.